Finn's doubt did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, grinding resistance inside his mind, a refusal to let the official version of Luna's death settle into permanence. At first, he told himself that grief was distorting his judgment, that the unease he felt was merely the aftershock of losing someone whose presence had once seemed indestructible. Death, after all, often left behind unanswered questions, fragments that never aligned cleanly. Yet as days turned into weeks, those fragments began to assemble into patterns that defied coincidence. Medical details failed to reconcile. Timelines felt manipulated. Witness accounts carried subtle inconsistencies that no amount of rational explanation could smooth over. Finn, trained to trust evidence over narrative, found himself unable to ignore the persistent sensation that something fundamental about Luna's supposed death was wrong. What unsettled him most was not a single anomaly, but the emotional flatness surrounding the event. Luna's disappearance had been dramatic, yet its resolution felt strangely muted, as though the world had been instructed to move on too quickly. Finn remembered the way Sheila's name hovered at the edges of every unanswered question. Never mentioned directly, yet impossible to exclude, Sheila had always thrived in ambiguity, in the spaces between certainty and fear. The more Finn revisited the circumstances, the more he sensed her familiar imprint, not as an obvious presence, but as a shaping force guiding events from the shadows. The breakthrough came late one night, in the quiet hours when exhaustion stripped away distraction and left only clarity. Finn had been reviewing archived footage, documents he had initially dismissed as irrelevant, when he noticed a detail so small it could easily have been overlooked. A timestamp did not match the official report. A shadow moved where no movement should have existed. A medical record referenced procedures inconsistent with a fatal outcome. Alone, each discrepancy meant nothing. Together, they formed a question too loud to silence. Finn's heart pounded as he followed the thread, cross-referencing data, reconstructing sequences, until the impossible conclusion emerged with terrifying plausibility. Luna had never died. The realization carried both hope and dread in equal measure. If Luna was alive, then everything that had followed her supposed death was built on a lie. And lies of that magnitude did not exist without purpose. Finn's thoughts returned inevitably to Sheila, whose capacity for deception and control had defined so much pain in their lives. The idea that she could have staged Luna's death, spiriting her away to some hidden location, was not far-fetched. It was consistent, it was methodical, and it explained too much. Finn did not share his discovery immediately. He understood the danger of acting prematurely, of alerting the wrong person before the truth could be secured. Instead, he turned first to Stephie, whose instincts had long mirrored his own when it came to recognizing Sheila's threat. The moment Finn revealed his suspicions, Stephie felt a cold certainty settle into her bones. Luna's absence had always felt unresolved to her, a wound that refused to scar over. The possibility that she was alive ignited a fierce determination, tempered by fear of what Sheila might already have done. Stephie understood that if Sheila was indeed holding Luna captive, every moment of delay increased the risk of irreversible harm. Liam joined them quietly, his involvement driven not by curiosity but by responsibility. He had seen too many lives destroyed by secrets left unchallenged, too many truths buried for the sake of temporary peace. Together, the three formed a fragile alliance bound by urgency and trust. They agreed to proceed without drawing attention, knowing that any overt move could provoke Sheila into accelerating her plans. Silence became their shield, discretion their only advantage. Their investigation unfolded in fragments, pieced together through indirect channels and careful observation. Finn traced financial anomalies that suggested off-the-grid expenditures. Stephie leveraged connections to map properties long associated with Sheila's movements, locations that existed beyond conventional oversight. Liam followed social trails, listening for whispers that hinted at a presence meant to remain unseen. Each discovery tightened the circle around a truth that grew darker with every step. Luna was alive, but she was not free. As the picture sharpened, the implications rippled outward. Luna's return would not be a simple reunion. It would detonate lives constructed around her absence. Deacon, who had reshaped his existence in the wake of her supposed death, would be forced to confront a reality that shattered his understanding of loss and responsibility. Electra, whose identity had evolved in response to that same absence, would face a reckoning with emotions she believed resolved. The past, long buried, would resurface with unforgiving force. Dylan, too, stood on the edge of consequence, though she remained unaware of how close the ground beneath her was to giving way. Her actions, choices made under pressure and justified by fear, had contributed to a chain of events she believed concluded. The reappearance of Luna would dismantle that illusion entirely. Accountability, delayed but not erased, would arrive with devastating clarity. As Finn, Stephie, and Liam drew closer to the truth, the tension intensified. They moved through days with forced normalcy, each interaction layered with unspoken urgency. Sleep came rarely. Trust was tested constantly. The knowledge that Sheila could be watching, anticipating their next move, lent every decision a dangerous weight. They knew her patterns well enough to understand that exposure alone would not end the threat. Sheila did not relinquish control willingly. She escalated. The location revealed itself almost by accident, hidden behind the facade of abandonment. A property long dismissed as irrelevant resurfaced through a trail of utility usage inconsistent with vacancy. Finn recognized the signs immediately. Controlled environments, limited access, systems designed to isolate rather than sustain. It was the kind of place where time blurred, where a captive could be kept alive yet invisible. The confirmation struck them all with equal force. Luna was there. Planning the rescue demanded precision. Impulse would be fatal. They needed evidence, leverage, and a strategy that accounted for Sheila's volatility. Finn's medical knowledge guided their assessment of Luna's likely condition, the risks she might face if Sheila felt cornered. Stephie focused on contingencies, preparing for outcomes she refused to voice aloud. Liam coordinated logistics, ensuring that when they moved, they would not be stopped by bureaucratic delay. Yet beneath the tactical focus, emotion simmered. Finn grappled with guilt, haunted by the possibility that Luna's suffering had continued because he had accepted a lie too readily. Stephie felt a familiar fear resurface. The dread that came with every reminder that Sheila's reach extended farther than anyone wanted to admit. Liam wrestled with anger, not only at Sheila, but at a system that allowed such manipulation to persist unchecked. The night they chose to act was heavy with anticipation. Silence enveloped them as they approached the site, each step charged with the knowledge that everything could change within minutes. They moved carefully, methodically, aware that rescue was not only about extraction but survival. When they finally reached Luna, the sight of her alive shattered whatever emotional defenses they had left. She was altered, marked by isolation and control, yet unmistakably real. Proof of life, undeniable and overwhelming. The confrontation that followed was chaotic and inevitable. Sheila's reaction oscillated between fury and desperation, her carefully constructed illusion collapsing under the weight of exposure. Control, once her greatest weapon, slipped through her grasp as reality asserted itself. Luna's freedom was secured not through triumph, but through necessity, a narrow escape forged by coordination and resolve rather than heroism. The aftermath unfolded with seismic impact. Luna's return dismantled the narratives built around her death, forcing truth into spaces that had long avoided it. Deacon's world reeled as grief transformed into betrayal, relief colliding with rage. Electra faced emotions she believed settled, now complicated by the knowledge that her understanding of the past had been manipulated. Trust fractured, identities shifted, and relationships strained under the weight of revelation. Dylan's reckoning arrived swiftly and without mercy. Actions once rationalized as survival strategies were exposed for what they were. Choices with consequences that could not be undone. Luna's presence stood as living testimony to the harm inflicted, demanding accountability that could no longer be deferred. For Finn, Stephie, and Liam, victory felt hollow. Luna was alive, but the cost of uncovering the truth reverberated through every life it touched. Sheila's shadow, though diminished, lingered as a reminder that evil rarely vanished cleanly. It receded, waiting for another opportunity, another fracture to exploit. Yet amid the devastation, something fragile emerged. Truth, once revealed, altered the terrain irrevocably. Lies lost their power. Silence no longer served as refuge. Luna's survival became a catalyst, not only for justice but for transformation. Lives would never return to what they had been before her disappearance. But perhaps they could become something more honest. As the dust settled, Finn understood that doubt, once dismissed as weakness, had saved a life. Stephie recognized that vigilance, though exhausting, remained necessary in a world where danger wore familiar faces. Liam accepted that responsibility did not end with intention but extended into consequence. And Luna, standing at the center of the storm she had unknowingly survived, became both a survivor and a mirror, reflecting the truth that no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, could remain buried forever. Hope began to sense the fractures long before anyone else was willing to name them. It was not a single argument or dramatic rupture that alerted her, but a pattern of subtle dissonance that repeated itself whenever Electra and Will occupied the same space. Their smiles arrived a second too late. Their silences stretched a beat too long. Conversations that should have felt intimate instead carried a cautious distance, as though both were constantly bracing for disappointment. Hope watched this dynamic unfold with the quiet intensity of someone who believed she recognized the warning signs because she had lived them herself. To her, love was not only about affection but about alignment, and she had learned through painful experience that misalignment, left unaddressed, only deepened into lasting damage. The conviction took root quickly and stubbornly. If she did not intervene now, Electra and Will would be hurt in ways that could have been prevented. Hope framed her concern as protection, not interference. She told herself that caring sometimes required action, that love expressed only through observation was a form of abandonment. In her mind, standing back while people she cared about drifted toward inevitable heartbreak would be the greater sin. She believed that emotional maturity came with responsibility, that those who had survived love's worst lessons owed something to those still navigating its earliest storms. Her own history had taught her how easily people mistook persistence for compatibility, how often fear of loneliness masqueraded as devotion. Watching Electra and Will, she felt an urgency that bordered on moral obligation, as though the universe itself were whispering that this was a moment that demanded correction. Stephie, however, saw something very different taking shape. Where Hope saw compassion, Stephie saw a familiar pattern she had learned to distrust. She remembered too clearly the unintended consequences of Hope's past attempts to orchestrate happiness, the emotional debris left behind when good intentions collided with other people's autonomy. To Stephie, love was not a puzzle to be solved by an outside observer, no matter how experienced or well-meaning. It was an arena where choice, accountability, and consequence belonged solely to those involved. When she noticed Hope growing increasingly invested in Electra's romantic life, a knot of unease tightened in her chest. It felt less like concern and more like control, dressed in the language of empathy. Hope defended herself with conviction when questioned. She spoke of perspective, of wisdom earned through mistakes and loss. She argued that experience sharpened perception, that living through heartbreak gave one the ability to recognize unhealthy patterns before they hardened into destiny. In her mind, intervention was not arrogance but foresight. She believed that destiny was not something passively endured but actively shaped, and that ignoring signs of incompatibility was a choice in itself, one that often led to regret. If she could spare Electra that regret, why shouldn't she try? The certainty with which she held this belief insulated her from doubt, allowing her to dismiss concerns as resistance to uncomfortable truths. Stephie confronted Hope directly, refusing to let unease fester into silence. Her warning was not subtle. She told Hope to stop inserting herself into Electra and Will's relationship, emphasizing that love, no matter how fragile it appeared from the outside, was not improved by manipulation. Stephie spoke of boundaries, of the right people had to make their own mistakes and learn from them. She reminded Hope that unintended harm often originated from the belief that one knew better than others what they needed. The consequences, she warned, were rarely contained. They spread outward, pulling families into conflicts they never asked to inherit. Hope listened, but she did not absorb the warning in the way Stephie intended. She interpreted it as fear of disruption rather than concern for autonomy. To Hope, Stephie's resistance felt rooted in a desire for order, for preserving appearances even when something underneath was clearly broken. She convinced herself that Stephie was projecting her own need for control onto a situation that required courage instead. With that rationalization firmly in place, Hope continued forward, her confidence unshaken by opposition. She began arranging opportunities for Electra to spend time with RJ, convinced that he represented a healthier, more balanced alternative. In Hope's narrative, this was not betrayal but redirection, a gentle nudge toward a future less fraught with emotional instability. Stephie's anger reached a breaking point when she witnessed Hope's influence firsthand. Seeing Hope openly steer Electra's attention elsewhere felt like a violation, not only of Electra's trust but of the implicit understanding that family members did not weaponize intimacy to validate their own beliefs. The subtlety Hope believed she was maintaining vanished in that moment, replaced by an unmistakable act of interference. Stephie's frustration crystallized into resolve. Silence was no longer an option. The situation demanded confrontation, not later, not privately, but immediately, before the damage extended further. The argument that followed was inevitable and explosive, fueled by years of unspoken tension between two fundamentally different philosophies of love. Stephie challenged Hope's assumption that intention equaled righteousness, arguing that responsibility did not end at motive but began there. She accused Hope of mistaking her own emotional scars for universal truth, of projecting her past onto lives that did not belong to her. Love, Stephie insisted, was not something to be engineered. It was something to be chosen, again and again, even when that choice led to pain. Shielding people from heartbreak, she argued, often robbed them of growth. Hope responded with equal intensity, rejecting the idea that non-intervention was inherently virtuous. She spoke of preventable suffering, of the cruelty of watching someone walk knowingly toward emotional ruin. She argued that society often romanticized endurance, encouraging people to remain in relationships that drained rather than nourished them. To Hope, offering an alternative was not coercion but compassion. She believed that silence in the face of obvious dysfunction was a form of negligence, one she refused to be complicit in. Her voice carried the weight of conviction, sharpened by a lifetime of watching love fail when people ignored warning signs. The argument escalated beyond Electra and Will, reaching into deeper territory neither woman could easily retreat from. Old wounds resurfaced, accusations blurred into confessions. The debate became less about a single relationship and more about who had the right to define happiness, and at what cost. Stephie accused Hope of playing savior at the expense of others' agency, of believing her moral clarity exempted her from accountability. Hope countered that Stephie was defending emotional stagnation under the guise of respect, unwilling to challenge relationships simply because disruption made her uncomfortable. As voices rose and emotions sharpened, the fracture between the Forrester and Logan families widened perceptibly. The tension carried echoes of past divisions, reminding everyone present how quickly philosophical disagreements could become generational rifts. What began as concern for Electra's well-being now threatened to reopen old battles over control, loyalty, and identity. The atmosphere grew heavy with the awareness that this conflict would not resolve cleanly, that it would leave impressions long after the argument ended. Stephie's final words landed with devastating clarity. She told Hope that good intentions did not absolve harm, that believing oneself right did not erase the damage caused by interference. She accused Hope of undermining happiness not through malice but through certainty, of refusing to recognize that people had the right to define their own paths, even when those paths led through pain. If Hope insisted on intervening, Stephie demanded, then she must also accept responsibility for the fallout, for the confusion and hurt her actions created. Hope stood her ground, but the certainty she clung to felt heavier now, burdened by the realization that conviction alone could not guarantee moral correctness. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that believing oneself compassionate did not protect one from becoming destructive. The conflict had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth, that love, when filtered through personal history and fear, could become indistinguishable from control. As the confrontation ended, nothing felt resolved. The family lines remained taut, stretched thin by opposing beliefs that refused to yield. Electra and Will stood unknowingly at the center of a storm shaped by others' decisions, their relationship now burdened with expectations and interventions it had never invited. Stephie walked away carrying the weight of responsibility she felt compelled to shoulder, determined to protect autonomy even when it meant enduring discomfort. Hope remained where she was, surrounded by the echoes of her own arguments, forced to question whether her desire to save others from pain had crossed the line into causing it. The conflict did not end with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. It lingered instead, embedded in glances, silences, and unresolved tension, threatening to fracture alliances that had barely healed from past wounds. And as the Forrester and Logan families braced themselves for the consequences, one truth became painfully clear. Love, when guided by certainty rather than humility, could be just as destructive as indifference.